It's not to say that it should have happened that way, but that it did.
It did, right? And so when we're doing history, we have to accept what did happen, not what we wish had happened.
Yeah.
Because that's what we inherit. We inherit actual history, not possible history. Although I guess we do in some sense inherit what prior generations felt was possible.
Yeah.
So we inherit their disappointment that we didn't achieve that version of the future, but we're here.
Yeah, and that future's with us as a potentiality. Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's with us as a potentiality. But so are other possibilities, right? That
exactly.
People in the past couldn't even have imagined.
Yes.
Because that's what freedom is, right? It's not just we don't inherit the past and repeat it. It's also not just inheriting the motives of the past and what people were trying to accomplish, and like inheriting other people's motives. We also initiate our own actions based on our own motives.
Yeah.
Right? In the moment, in the present moment.
Yeah.
At least we strive to do that.
Yeah.
But we don't always do that, though, right? So
most people don't most of the time.
So that's why...
Most of us don't, most of the time.
Right. That's why history remains a...
flow of inertia. Well, I shouldn't say a flow of inertia. That doesn't make sense.
Well, it remains a failure if history has a goal, which is like civilization. Civilization remains like a nice idea.
I just started to read Speaker's Meaning by Owen Barfield, and he starts out talking about how, I just read the first couple pages, but he's saying that there is, I think he brought up Toynbee, something, is that how you pronounce his name?
I think so.
And he was writing about history, I think.
Yeah.
And he was comparing the novelty of history as something that people are concerned with. Because it wasn't something people were concerned with in the past. They were concerned with the past for specific reasons, but not for the sake of itself, basically, for like how things happen. People weren't really, exactly how things happen. People weren't concerned with that. So he says, that's basically a modern phenomenon, and that it's similar to when there was the discovery of natural science apart from philosophy. Yeah. I haven't gotten further than that, but that was just interesting for me to...
the interest in history as something like that has a value for its own sake.
Yeah. As like basically the record of what has transpired.
Right.
What has really transpired.
Yeah. I mean, so it's not just that the truth it is that it's the truth of history that becomes most important, not just like the value of it or the beauty of it
or like the way that it kind of serves individual human development as a story. You know what I mean? That's what I think history used to be especially important for, was like cultural identity and the mythos and the legends, and
right.
That's what Barfield was referencing.
So we have history as the idea of the record that historians want to make accurate and true, but we don't really have history anymore as like a sense of purpose, like continuous purpose or a continuity of values that like we inherit from our parents or from prior generations, like things like patriotism. Like we don't have...
That's what the Trumpists
right.
people are kind of resisting, right? Because they want to maintain this narrative about America that is false.
Right.
They want to keep the statues up. I mean, I guess I shouldn't lump all Trump supporting individuals together, but
Sure.
you know, those
we only get
who
two
are,
choices in America, right? And so you fall on one side or the other.
Yeah.
Some people choose Trump because they don't like the other side, not necessarily because they like Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard some people say that, at least. But yeah. So the Trumpists have a false version of history, say, and what is the true version of American history?
Well, I think
like
it's forcing itself into consciousness right now.
Right. So how we tell the story of what really happened is, but it's never going to be just like a scientific thing. Like
Exactly.
Like
that's what
professional
that's what Barfield
historians.
was writing.
Yeah, we all have to participate.
That's a mistake.
Right.
Yeah.
We have to
think
participate in inheriting it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We have to. That's another thing that's hard about this moment, that we're asked to like recognize that history is what we're inheriting, right?
Yeah.
And we have to let it move through us and affect us. And then there's like a lot of confusion about what to do next, how to move forward. And
yeah, because if we objectify history as just a bunch of facts out there that we can judge, like we stand apart from it and judge it or critique it, then we forget that we require some grounds to stand on for our
self-understanding,
for our own self-understanding, and for our arguments to hold any weight.
Yeah.
We're always products of our history, of our circumstance in a socio-historical sense.
Yeah.
So we can't, there is no like space of transcendental critique where you can step out of history and critique it as something objective that you're separate from. You're always going to be performing yourself the values of the history that you inherit.
Yes, but I think I would like to qualify that, because I think, if you do, that's sort of what I was saying earlier, that there's something about Christianity, but also the idea of the evolution of consciousness that, presupposes a transcendent aspect to reality that we also partake in. And, so there are certain figures who have, insisted that we as human beings have the capacity for supersensible perception through intuition, which is a kind of coalescing, I think, with the spiritual world, which I would say encompasses the realm of ideas as well as, beings. And so that maybe there is a possibility of intuitively uniting with that to somehow glimpse the history, the evolution of consciousness, and be able to say something true about it. But to come back to what you were saying, it would still be mediated through context.
If you're able to express the truth,
context.
Yeah, if you are able to express the truth of your own history, it will be because you're participating in the good carried by that lineage that you're an expression of.
Yeah.
Right? And so, and I guess we'd need to distinguish here, between the transcendental and the transcendent. That's an important distinction just for philosophy and Kant studies, but Hans-Georg Müller also made a video about, looking at Philosophy Tube's video about Kant, critiquing it because there was a conflation between those terms. I'm not saying you did that, but when I say there's no way to step outside of history into some neutral space of transcendental critique, what I'm saying is that when Kant tried to do that, he was really just affirming and performing the European, the 18th century European consciousness, right? And there's a nobility in that, but there's also a shadow because it doesn't see itself as provincial, it sees itself as universal.
Yeah, well, exactly. And
But the
so-
transcendent is something else.
But the transcendental and the transcendent are related
Sure.
in that
But how?
that idea that there can be, a transcendental time space apart from which to critique things, I think is connected with the idea that the transcendent, and it's, how Rick talks about like the sun or the good being introjected, into the human psyche. And
In the Copernican revolution.
yeah, so now
Rick
the
Times.
transcendent is like us. We're identified with it rather than trying to comport to it.
Well, right, because the transcendent is, I think, related to the transcendental, but different in the sense that it's participatory, whereas the Kantian
Yeah.
transcendental maneuver is explicitly not participatory.
But what's different is that after Kant, now there begins to be more of, with Romanticism and German idealism, more of like an individual that is participating.
Yes.
Whereas before Kant, there wasn't as much of an individual.
Yeah, Kant triggered something in the evolution of consciousness, which he had no intention of triggering.
Or maybe this is what Barfield would say, that he just is articulating what is unfolding. And
Right.
not necessarily, so it's complicated, but, that's a kind of, maybe, that's related to this an idea of formal causation.
Sure. Let's stay with Kant for a second, because obviously I didn't mean to say in an absolute sense that it's not a form of participation, but explicitly non-participatory, because strictly speaking, you can't can't not participate. But
Yeah.
in Kant, though, the transcendental is almost the opposite of the transcendent, in the sense that to be transcendentally conditioned by your categories and forms of intuition of space and time means that you can only perceive the phenomenal appearances.
Mm-hmm.
You can know that there is something beyond those appearances, but not anything else about it, just that it exists.
Yeah.
And so the transcendent becomes something you are necessarily cut off from, right, in Kant.
Yeah.
You're isolated in your own conceptual webs that the understanding is driven to spin and tangle itself in. Reason, at least, becomes tangled, thinking it can know something about a reality independent of itself. But so if we're going to recover the transcendent, I think we have to do it in a different way than Kant, because he forbid us from accessing it.
Yeah.
But if we have a more, if we build on Goethe or Schelling or Steiner, and we see that, as Jake Sherman likes to say, that the transcendent or transcendence is the superlative form of immanence. Right? Doesn't Jake say that?
Mm-hmm.
So, well, like you were saying, it's something that each individual has to become adequate to. It's not something it's something that each individual participates in and realizes, so that it's not merely universal, right? Nor is it merely particular. The individual is like mediates the particular and the universal by incarnating the transcendent. And so that's a post-Kantian or maybe non-Kantian form of transcendence that is not about referencing some other world that's beyond, but rather referencing the highest potential of the present moment in our earthly selves.
Yeah. It reminds me of that Flammarion, is that how you pronounce it? The image of the, it's like, it comes up when you search astrology on like Wikipedia.
Oh, the guy reaching through the threshold of the sky to see the great beyond.
His half of his body is in the normal realm of appearances, what we experience every day. And then he's reaching into the archetypal one, so his head and his arm and part of the top of his body is in it. And I feel like that picture so wonderfully illustrates like the true Neoplatonist or Hermetic perspective of the cosmos. That so like for example, when Steiner talks about the spiritual world, it's not somewhere else. It's just, for you to be able to perceive it relies upon you having cultivated or having been given by grace somehow the organs of perception to perceive it.
Yeah.
Also, when you were talking about Kant and his philosophy, and you described it as like being shut off or something like that, it made me think of Steiner's. He has like an image or of the evolution of consciousness, and for him it's like basically like a U, and modernity is we're at the bottom of the U.
Yeah.
And the U represents basically being separated from the spiritual world.
Minimally participatory.
Yeah.
It's like the null
It's
point,
the
Barfield
dark.
calls it. Right?
Yeah.
It's the null point of the evolution of consciousness, where consciousness imagines itself to be totally separated
Yeah.
from the universe.
Yeah. Yep, exactly.
So I guess we have to crawl our way out of this hole by remembering how we got into it.
Yeah.
Which is the historical task.
That's really interesting, to think about, if we're kind of carrying on the legacy of those who were trying to theorize the evolution of consciousness, that, you were just saying that we kind of have to win our way back to that experience, something like that. And, a lot of, right now, like, with the cultural conflicts, like, there's the kind of European contribution, especially the aspects of the European contribution that have been Euro-American, materialist and scientistic, and just abstract, are being challenged, and also these groups, black people who come from various different enslaved African groups, and beyond that as well, and indigenous peoples who are pressing their histories into the collective consciousness, and some of those histories have maintained to some extent, or those history bearers have maintained to some extent the practices and
Epistemologies.
Yeah, the epistemologies, the stories, and that, I think that's related to maybe this
technologies.
Yeah, this shift back towards an openness, but at the same time, there's this kind of flip side shadow of that being kind of co-opted and commodified by consumerism, by capitalism, and mixed with the kinds of values that we want to move on from, exploitative. So it's an interesting time to be alive, because now all the magical stuff is normal, right? And a lot of it has now become commodified, and so we live in I feel like an even more intense time, under capitalism, because these aspects of ourselves that used to not really be commodified are, like our spiritual striving and things like that.
Yeah, I've been reading Whitehead's book Adventures of Ideas, and he talks a lot about commerce, right? Commercial activity. And he's writing in the early 1930s in America. It's the middle of the Great Depression, between the world wars, right? Hitler is sort of in power in Germany, so it's in that context. And he's really saying, hey, commercial activity, trade, economics is probably our greatest hope.
Oh.
Because it's peaceful, or at least when it's not destroying the environment and exploiting labor, it's it could be peaceful if you take care of the workers and you pay attention to, not poisoning your nest. That he took as preconditions of doing commerce in a humane way. But he was definitely like, he says he's not a socialist.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say I'm a capitalist, but he says that, free enterprise, he wasn't using the term market yet, but the notion of commerce and the ability to basically what we would say nowadays, like start your own business, your own association. The government, the state should not interfere with your ability to associate for economic purposes. And he thought that when human beings are afforded the opportunity, and so there's a need for equality of opportunity in a democratic society, so that everyone has the ability to start an association that is in some ways profitable to them because of the ways it allows for cooperation. And I feel like nowadays, like the people who are on the left, who critique capitalism, they're really good at critiquing the evils of capitalism, but they don't really have a clear model of, and I speak about myself, like I don't really have a clear model of what our very complex society should look like if we got rid of capitalism.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something about what capitalism has achieved that should continue.
Yeah.
And there's something about it that obviously needs to be transformed, but it's not necessarily easy to figure out how to thread that needle.
Well, maybe, because I feel like I'm sort of not the most learned around economics or even different theories of social organization, but it seems to me that what capitalism really celebrates and empowers is the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And now, what the other, like communism and socialism, are trying to offer is, a vision of our human sociality that is also, social, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ecological. So I think that, definitely in the future, like, because this is the scary thing about eco-fascism and things like that, we want to preserve individuality,
right,
in some way, in a sane way, in a compassionate way, right? In a way that doesn't just allow greed. Like, our culture valorizes greed and vanity and gluttony, all. And so, capitalism is kind of swollen monster, ravenous monster, but it doesn't have to be.
No, but you're right. It does value the individual.
Yeah.
Puts the individual kind of at the center of everything.
So the individual just needs to be tempered.
But there's also the other side of capitalism, which is the corporation, which is given personhood legally. And so...
Yeah.
That's
like hyper-individualism.
Yeah. And so it's a weird sort of...
maybe that's not the right word.
Well,
like hyper-object.
Yeah, corporations are hyper-individuals, you could say.
And some of them are owned by individuals, right? Like Elon Musk and George Bezos. Jeff Bezos. George Bezos.
Yeah. George Soros, you're probably thinking of.
Maybe.
All the big billionaires. But the corporation, I think, Whitehead talks about that too in this Adventures of Ideas book. It's a legal fiction that sort of operates in the marketplace as if it were an individual.
Totally, I mean,
and that's how are we supposed
to have their identities,
right? And how are we, like human individuals, supposed to compete with these monsters?
Who was it? I think it was a beer who gave a presentation once, and he was connecting the archetypes, or the planetary archetypes, the gods and the goddesses, with brands, and they definitely have personalities, you could say. They're
egregores. Do you know that term? It's like...
Oh, probably more like an egregore, yeah. So I'm not saying they're equivalent, but...
Yeah. Yeah, they're like congealed social energies or imaginal forces.
It's like,
So they don't have independent agency except that which is given to them by...
assemblages.
Yeah.
At least as I think of them.
Marx
in
would
the
call them
Platonic
like a fetish.
perspective.
It's an
fetish.
abstraction that people with false consciousness in in unjust society, they're abstractions that we believe in and that we're willing to like die for, even though they're not actually what they appear to be. So I think if we could deal somehow with the problem of greedy, rapacious corporations who literally like control science, so much so that it was like, and a great example is ExxonMobil in the 70s with its scientists figured out that the burning of fossil fuels releasing greenhouse gases was going to start heating the earth up and potentially raise sea levels and cause extreme weather and drought, all sorts of things. They knew that in the 70s because they had a monopoly on like the most advanced climatology, climate science. So, and what did they do? They kept extracting oil. And so
I don't get it.
the corporate profit mode, like corporations are individuals and they are clearly sociopathic.
You know, bringing up Steiner again, but he would talk about different kinds of adversarial type beings. And so I was reading this little article or lesson from Lisa Romero, who's an anthroposophist, and she described Ahriman and Lucifer as the names for egoism and materialism. She's like, it might seem strange that we have names for these, but they are forces that exceed and inform our being, our individual being. But anyway, so he would...
Lucifer is egoism. Ahriman is materialism.
And they conspire. But anyway, I was going to say, he also talks about asuras, and those are kind of more like brute type. I was reminded of those when you were talking about corporations as egregores.
Right, I like that. I do think of Lucifer and Ahriman as real beings. In a sense that like Coca-Cola and Nike and Gatorade and...
Oh, I wouldn't compare them, But I meant more the way you were talking about the oil companies. And their their titanic thirst.
Yes.
Their titanic greed. You know, they're monstrous.
The corporations are in a way minions of Lucifer and Ahriman. They're rooted in a materialistic conception of nature. They presuppose a materialistic conception of nature.
Well, and they're driven by egoism.
And they're driven by the egoism of the CEOs and
the social Darwinism and
the engineering mentality. Not that there's anything wrong with engineering, because we need that if we're going to save the planet too. But when it's driven by the profit motive and the desire to master and control nature for the benefit of a few.
If it were pious engineering, it would be magic.
Yeah.
White magic.
Imagineering.
Or